everybody. In this video, we're going to talk about how to solve percentage problems. So when you're solving a percentage problem, there's three different types of problems that you may need to solve. One of them is a missing part problem. So for example, if you had a car was purchased for $13,000 with a 20% down payment and you needed to figure out how much the down payment was, this would be an example of a missing part problem because we're looking for the amount of the down payment, which is a smaller part of the total cost of the car, which was $13,000. You can also have percentage problems where you're missing the percentage. So for example, if Susan scored 48 points on a 60-point test, what percentage did she get correct? In this case, we know that she got 48 points out of 60 points correct, and the 48 points is the part, the 60 points is the total amount, and we want to know what percentage that is. The last type of problem that you may be asked to solve is one where there's a missing whole. Like, for example, if 90% of the senior class is going on a class trip, and there are 162 seniors going on the trip, and you want to figure out how many seniors there are total, well, the 162 is the 90% that's going on the trip, but we're asked to find out how many seniors there are altogether, which would be 100% of the senior class. And that would be an example of a missing whole problem. So when you're solving percentage problems, there's several different approaches you can use. So I'm going to start off by explaining the grid approach and go through and solve these three problems, and then I'm going to show you two other approaches. So with the grid approach, you use a 100 square, like we have here, to represent 100%. And so in this case, since a car was purchased for $13,000 with a 20% down payment, and we want to know how much the down payment was, well, what that means is that this whole block is going to represent $13,000. And what that means, since there's 100 little squares within this whole block, is that each one of these little squares represents $130. And so if we're asked to find the 20% down payment and figure out what that amount is, then we basically just need to figure out what 20 of these 100 blocks represent. And so we could say, okay, well, if each of the blocks is 130, then how much is 20 of them? To figure this out, we could do 130 times 20, and we could use our mental math strategies to say, well, 13 times 2 is 26, and since 130 is 10 times 13, I can multiply my answer by 10, and since 20 is 10 times 2, I can multiply that by 10 as well, and it looks like the amount of the down payment is going to be $2,600. And you don't have to use mental math to figure this out. You could also multiply it out by hand if that's easier for you. But basically the idea is that we are looking for the amount that's represented by these 20 blocks. If we were to use the grid approach for this problem, where we have a missing percentage, it says Susan scored 48 points on a 60-point test, and we want to figure out what percentage she got correct. So the whole amount is 60 points. So this entire block is represented is representing 60 points, which means that each one of these little squares represents 0.6, because if you take 60 and divide it up into 100 pieces, each piece is going to be 0.6. And so then the question is how many 0.6s does it take to get to 48? Well, if we look at it, 10 of the 0.6s would be 6. So that would be 6. Then we would have another 10 would be 12, because every 10 groups of 0.6 will be 6 points on the test. And then we'd say, okay, the next one would be a total of 18 points. Then we would have 24 points. And then 10 more would give us 30 points on the test. 10 more percentage points would give us 36. And 10 more beyond that would give us 42, and 10 more beyond that would give us 48. And so when Susan scored 48 points, if we look at the number of percentage boxes that we have, it looks like she has a percentage of 80%. And that's how you can use the grid approach to find a missing percentage. To use the grid approach on the last problem, where we have 90% of the senior class is going on a class trip, and there are 162 seniors going on the trip, how many seniors are there? Well, the way that we'd figure this out is we'd say, okay, well, we know that 90%, so not the whole box, but just 90 of the 100 squares, represent 162 students. And so we say, okay, well, how much does each box represent then if 90 boxes corresponds to 162 seniors? So I can figure this out by doing 162 divided by 90. And when I divide 162 by 90, 90 doesn't go into 1, and it also doesn't go into 16, but it goes into 162 once. And so that would take care of 90. If I subtract that to see what my remainder is, I would have 2 1s and 7 10s. And then I could exchange those 72 1s for 720 tenths. And if I do 90 going into 720, that would be 8, because 8 times 90 is 720 exactly, which gives me no remainder. And so that tells me that each one of these boxes represents 1.8 seniors. And so to figure out how many seniors there are, I just need to say, okay, well, how much is there in the 100 square altogether? Well, if each one of those little squares represents 1.8 seniors, then I can just do 1.8 times 100, which moves the decimal over twice. And basically, that would tell me that there's 180 seniors altogether. And if you think about the context of the problem, that makes sense because 90% of the seniors were 162 seniors. And so it makes sense that 100% of the class would be 180 seniors. So that's how the grid approach works. But another approach that you can also use when solving percentages is the proportion approach. So if we were to solve this same problem with a proportion approach instead of a grid approach, the way that we would do it is we would set up one ratio that has to do with like the actual amounts, and then we'd have one ratio that has to do with the percentage amounts. So we would say, okay, well, the total cost of the car is $13,000 in actual amounts, and in percentage amounts, that represents 100%. And so the total amount is on the bottom of our fraction. And then on the top, we would have 20% in the percentage ratio. And then we want to figure out what the actual amount was for the down payment, which is like the partial part of the total amount. And so once you have your two ratios set up, you can make it a proportion by setting them equal to each other. And then you can use cross multiplying or whatever method you prefer for figuring out what the missing number is. So if I wanted to use cross multiplying to solve this, I might say, okay, well, 100 times x is 100x, and 20 times 13,000 could be calculated by doing 2 times 13, which is 26. And then I would have 4 zeros after that. Then I would divide both sides by 100 to figure out what the x is. And when I divide by 100, the decimal moves over twice, and I would get $2,600, which is the same answer that we got with the grid approach. This is just a different way of doing it. So that's how you would use the proportion approach when you are missing one of the parts. So like in this case, we were looking for the amount of the down payment. But you can also use the proportion approach when you're looking for a missing percentage. So in this case, where we have Susan scoring 48 points on a 60-point test, well, that means the total number of points on the test was 60, and the part that she got correct was 48 points. And so this ratio is going to be set equal to the percentage ratio, which has 100% on the bottom because that's the total amount. Like 100% is always the total amount. And then we're trying to figure out what percentage the part is that she got correct. So if we wanted to solve this, we could solve it in the same way that we did the last one by cross multiplying and saying, okay, 100 times 48 is 4,800. 60 times x is 60x. If you divide both sides by 60, well, 48 divided by 6 is going to be 8. And 4,800 divided by 60 will cancel out one of the zeros, and so you'll have 80. And so x equals 80, which tells us that she got an 80% on the test, which again is the same answer we got with the grid approach. It's just a different method. And then the last type of problem you could solve with a proportion approach is the one where you have a missing whole. So in this case, we know that 90% of the senior class is going on a class trip, and there's 162 seniors going on the trip, and we want to know how many seniors there are altogether, not just the ones that are going on the class trip. So in this case, the way we would set up our ratios is we would say, okay, well, we have 90 out of 100, and that's our percentage ratio. And this is going to be equal to the amounts that we are actually working with here. And the 162 refers to the 90% of the senior class that's going on the trip. And so we're trying to find the whole. So we could find this by cross multiplying, and we would get 1,6,200 equals 90x. If I divide both sides by 90, well, that tells me that x equals whatever 16,200 divided by 90 is. And you could go through and calculate this out with long division, but for the sake of time for this video, I'm just going to use my calculator. And when I do 16,200 divided by 90, that gives me 180. And so that tells me that there are 180 seniors altogether. The last approach that you can use to solve percentage problems is the equation approach. So the general structure of the equation approach is to have the part equal whatever your percentage is written as a decimal. So you want to write it as a decimal because that makes it so you can multiply it. And you're going to take that percentage and multiply by the whole amount. And so in this case, since I'm looking for the down payment, that's my part, and I'm going to have the thing I'm looking for, x, which is the down payment, equal to the percentage, which was 20%, so 0.20, times 13,000. And if you take your calculator and calculate out 0.20 times 13,000, that tells you that x equals $2,600, which is the same thing that we got on our previous slides, and this would be our answer in this case. If you wanted to use the equation approach in this case, we would say, okay, well, the part, which is 48 points in this case, equals the percentage, which we don't know yet, times 60. So to find out what the percentage is, you would divide both sides by 60, and you would get x equals 48 over 60. If you type that into your calculator or do long division with it, 48 divided by 60 is 0.8, which is what x is. And remember that this is the decimal form of the percentage. So if we wanted to answer the question of what percentage did she get correct, well, we would just move the decimal over twice to turn it into a percentage, and we would get that x equals 80%. And so that's how you would use the equation approach to find the missing percentage. And then the last type of problem can also be solved with the equation approach, because in this case, we have the part, which is 162. That's going to equal the percentage as a decimal, which is 0.9, because that's 90% as a decimal, times the whole. So I'll call that x. So to find out what x is, I would divide both sides by 0.9. If you use either long division or a calculator to calculate out what 162 divided by 0.9 is, that would give you 180. And so that tells you that there are 180 seniors, which is the same answer we got with the proportion approach as well as the grid approach. And so when you're solving the three different types of percentage problems, any one of these problems can be solved either with the grid approach, the proportion approach, or the equation approach. And it's helpful to teach your students all three approaches so that they have multiple different ways of thinking about how to approach percentage problems. So that's it for this lesson. If you have any questions, let me know.